The first whisper came before the coffin was even closed. "Can you believe she married into the Whitmores?" Danielle Brooks heard it clearly. She stood beside her mother's casket in a quiet South Side Chicago chapel, one hand resting protectively over her 8-month pregnant belly. The room smelled of lilies and polished wood, but the tension in the air had nothing to do with grief. It came from the people sitting in the first 2 rows. The Whitmores, expensive coats, diamond cufflinks, faces that looked like they had never taken the L train in their lives. Grant Whitmore, Danielle's husband, stood a few feet away, speaking quietly with a banker who had somehow decided a funeral was still an appropriate networking opportunity. Then Grant's mother, Evelyn Whitmore, leaned toward one of her friends and said something just loud enough for the entire chapel to hear. Well, this is what happens when a family reaches above their station. A few quiet laughs followed. Danielle felt every pair of eyes slide toward her. Her mother's coffin was 3 feet away, and somehow this had turned into a performance. If stories about betrayal, power, and unexpected justice keep you watching, take a second to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel. Because this moment was only the beginning of a story the Whitmore family would soon wish had never started. Danielle didn't respond. Not because she didn't hear them, because she had spent the last 7 years learning exactly how the Whitmore family worked. They smiled in public, they humiliated in private, and they believed silence meant weakness. Evelyn stood and approached the front of the chapel, placing a hand dramatically over her chest. "So tragic," she said loudly to the small crowd. "Angela Brooks worked very hard her whole life, sewing clothes for people in this neighborhood, wasn't it?" Another quiet laugh rippled through the Whitmore guests. Danielle's jaw tightened. Her mother had owned a tiny tailoring shop for 30 years. That much was true. But the way Evelyn said it made it sound like Angela Brooks had been a charity case. Grant finally walked over, placing a hand on Danielle's shoulder. "You okay?" he asked softly. Danielle looked at him, waiting for him to say something to his mother, waiting for him to correct the humiliation happening beside her mother's coffin. Grant didn't. Instead, he squeezed her shoulder once and turned back toward his family. Message received. Danielle slowly exhaled and rested her hand over her stomach again. Inside, the baby shifted slightly. Across the room, Evelyn Whitmore leaned toward another guest and whispered something else. This time, Danielle heard every word. At least Grant tried to help the girl move up in life. The chapel grew uncomfortably quiet. No one noticed the young attorney standing near the back of the room. No one noticed the folder in his hands. And no one in that chapel, not the Whitmores, not the investors, not even Grant, realized something that would soon change the balance of power in the entire city of Chicago. Angela Brooks had not left her daughter a sewing shop. She had left her a financial structure worth billions. And within the next few weeks, the Whitmore family was going to learn the most dangerous mistake powerful people can make. They had humiliated the only person holding the future of their empire. 7 years earlier, Danielle Brooks believed she had built her life the right way. She had earned a graduate degree in urban planning, secured a competitive position at Chicago's Department of Infrastructure, and spent most of her days reviewing development proposals that would reshape the city's transit corridors. She liked the work because it felt honest. Numbers, zoning maps, public impact reports. Nothing about her life suggested she would ever step into the world of the Whitmore family. Grant Whitmore entered her life during a public redevelopment hearing. He arrived late, confident, carrying the quiet authority of someone who was used to rooms adjusting when he walked in. His company was proposing a luxury residential complex near a future rail expansion corridor. Danielle was the analyst assigned to the project. Their first conversation lasted less than 10 minutes. Grant smiled, asked thoughtful questions about transit projections, and thanked her for her work. It felt respectful, normal. A week later, he asked her to dinner. At first, the relationship seemed balanced. Grant was charming, attentive, and openly impressed by her career. He told people Danielle was one of the smartest women he had ever met. But the shift started the first time he brought her to meet his family. The Whitmore estate sat along Lake Michigan, a sprawling property that looked more like a private club than a home. Danielle arrived wearing the same quiet confidence she carried into every professional meeting. It lasted about 5 minutes. Evelyn Whitmore greeted her with a tight smile and a quick scan from head to toe. "So you're the city planner," Evelyn said. Danielle nodded politely. "Urban infrastructure analyst," she corrected. Evelyn's smile never changed. How practical. At dinner, the questions came disguised as curiosity. Where did Danielle grow up? Did her mother really run a tailoring shop? How many people work there? Did Danielle ever help with the sewing? Each question sounded harmless, but together they built a picture the Whitmores clearly enjoyed painting. A hard-working girl from the South Side who had somehow landed inside their world. Grant laughed off the tension, pouring wine, changing subjects, telling stories about college. Every time the conversation edged toward humiliation, he smoothed it over. Danielle noticed it, but she told herself something simple. Families were complicated. Grant was not his parents. A year later, he proposed. The engagement moved quickly. Grant insisted on handling most of the legal and financial paperwork himself. "It's just routine stuff," he told her one night, sliding a folder across the kitchen counter. Danielle skimmed the documents without much concern. Marriage contracts, property structures, liability protections. It looked like the kind of paperwork wealthy families always required. She signed where the tabs indicated. The wedding took place at a private club overlooking the lake. The Whitmores filled the front rows with investors, developers, and political donors. Danielle's side of the room was much smaller. Her mother sat proudly in the first row, wearing a dress she had sewn herself. Angela Brooks spent most of the evening smiling quietly while watching her daughter enter a world she hoped would treat her well. But the shift came quickly after the honeymoon. The Whitmore family dinners became more frequent, more controlled. Danielle noticed something else too. Grant began making more decisions without asking. Financial accounts moved under joint management. Their home belonged to a Whitmore development company rather than either of them personally. When Danielle questioned it, Grant waved it off. "It's just easier for tax structure," he explained. At family gatherings, Evelyn's comments became sharper. "You must be proud, Danielle," she said once during dinner. "Most girls from your background don't get opportunities like this." Grant stayed quiet. Another time, when Danielle described a major transportation project she was working on, Evelyn interrupted with a soft laugh. "Well, that sounds complicated, but I suppose city work is very different from real business." Grant smiled faintly and changed the subject. Each moment seemed small, but they stacked. Year after year, the pattern became impossible to ignore. Danielle was welcome in the Whitmore family, just not as an equal. And somewhere behind the scenes, decisions were being made about her life that she didn't even know existed. Decisions that Grant Whitmore had started putting in motion long before he ever bought the engagement ring. 3 months before the wedding, Grant Whitmore sat in a private conference room on the 39th floor of a downtown law office and heard the first sentence that changed everything. "She doesn't know what she's about to inherit." Across from him, attorney Richard Sloan opened a file marked Brooks Family Holdings and slid a document across the table. Grant frowned. "You're sure?" Sloan nodded once. "I'm very sure." Grant had not gone there out of love or curiosity. He had gone because Evelyn Whitmore never trusted coincidence. Her son was preparing to marry a black woman from the South Side whose mother ran a modest tailoring shop, and Evelyn wanted the background checked before the wedding made the family vulnerable. She expected debt, embarrassment, maybe some hidden relative who would become inconvenient later. Instead, Richard Sloan found land. Old land. Years earlier, Angela Brooks had quietly entered a small investment group tied to freight corridors, rail expansion routes, and industrial parcels no one wanted at the time. Most of the original partners had sold early. Angela had not. Through layers of legal structures, those parcels had been held, transferred, protected, and rolled into a private trust designed to stay invisible until certain conditions were met. Chicago expanded. Transit routes shifted. Developers came in. The value exploded. Grant stared at the numbers again. "How much?" Sloan answered without emotion. enough to alter control of multiple redevelopment zones. That's not a number. It's because the number keeps changing. Grant leaned back in his chair, suddenly very still. Who controls it? Not Angela directly. Not anymore. The trust holds it. Then who benefits? Sloan looked him in the eye. Danielle Brooks. The room went quiet. Grant said nothing for several seconds, but his mind was already moving. He saw leverage, access, expansion. He saw every stalled Whitmore project that could be revived with one hidden source of collateral. He saw his father's respect, his mother's approval, his own future getting bigger in real time. One question remained. Does Danielle know? No. Does Angela? Sloan closed the file. Enough to protect it, not enough to trust people around her. Grant left that meeting with a different understanding of his engagement. Until that morning, Danielle had been the woman he was going to marry. By that afternoon, she had become the center of a financial strategy. That night, he drove to his parents' house on the lake. Evelyn was waiting in the sitting room with a glass of wine, and the expression she wore when she expected confirmation of her instincts. Well, she asked. Grant handed her the summary packet. She read the first page, then the second, then looked up sharply. Angela Brooks? Grant nodded. Evelyn's voice dropped. You're telling me that little sewing shop was a cover? Not a cover, Grant said, just not the whole story. His father, Theodore Whitmore, read over Evelyn's shoulder. He said very little, but Grant saw the shift in his face. Calculation, interest, respect. Evelyn set the papers down carefully. Does Danielle know what she is? Grant caught the phrasing immediately. Not what she has, what she is. No, he said. Evelyn stood and crossed the room slowly. Then listen to me very carefully. If this trust is attached to Danielle, then Danielle is no longer just a fiancée. She is an entry point. Grant didn't answer. He didn't need to. The conversation moved fast after that. The wedding date should stay in place. No delay. No unnecessary conflict. Everything should remain warm, generous, normal. And after the marriage, the paperwork could be managed gradually. Shared assets, joint structures, estate protections, post-marital adjustments, the kind of elegant legal language wealthy families used when they wanted control without saying the word out loud. Grant told himself it was practical. He told himself Danielle would benefit too. He told himself this was what serious families did with serious money. Then he drove to Danielle's apartment, brought flowers, kissed her at the door, and asked if she was still free for dinner with the caterer on Friday. She smiled and said yes. And instead of protecting her from it, he had chosen to move closer. Not because he loved her more once he knew, because now he understood exactly what marrying her could buy him. The first year of marriage taught Danielle how humiliation could be dressed up as family culture. It started small, a dinner here, a comment there, a joke that landed too hard and stayed in the room too long. At Sunday lunches, Evelyn Whitmore had a way of turning every conversation into a ranking system. Who had money? Who had pedigree? Who had taste? Danielle learned quickly that none of those words meant what they pretended to mean. They meant bloodline. They meant power. They meant people like the Whitmores. One afternoon, Danielle mentioned a transit access report she had helped finish for the city. It was a major project, one that could affect thousands of working families on the south and west sides. Evelyn smiled over her glass. That's sweet. You always did care about buses and sidewalks. The table laughed softly. Danielle looked at Grant. He gave her that same familiar look. Calm down. Let it pass. Don't turn this into something bigger. So she said nothing. That became the pattern. Every insult arrived in polished language. Every dismissal came wrapped in a smile. And every time Danielle looked to her husband, Grant chose ease over loyalty. When they bought their first home, Danielle thought they were building something together. Then she learned the property was not in their names. It was owned by a Whitmore holding company tied to one of Grant's development entities. Why would we do that, she asked, standing in the kitchen with closing papers spread in front of her. Grant barely looked up from his phone. Tax efficiency. It doesn't feel like our house if your company owns it. He sighed, as if she were being difficult for no reason. Danielle, this is how high net worth families protect assets. The phrase stayed with her. Protect assets. Not build a life, not buy a home, protect assets. A few months later, Grant encouraged her to merge more of their accounts for simplicity. Then came new insurance documents, estate paperwork, signature pages slipped into stacks of routine mail. Most of it moved too fast, too casually. Grant always had an explanation ready. This is standard. This helps long-term planning. My attorney's already reviewed everything. Each time Danielle hesitated, he made hesitation sound naive. She was smart enough to catch patterns at work, smart enough to review infrastructure models, and spot risks inside thousands of pages of city proposals. But inside her marriage, the manipulation was personal, constant, and soft enough to make resistance feel irrational. That was the point. The pressure from the Whitmore family increased every year. At one holiday dinner, Theodore Whitmore asked Danielle whether her mother was still doing alterations in that little storefront. Evelyn followed with a laugh and added, Angela must be relieved her daughter married stability. Danielle set down her fork. My mother built her business from nothing. You don't have to respect her background, but you will respect her work. The room went still. For 1 second, Danielle thought Grant might finally step in beside her. Instead, he touched her arm under the table and said quietly, Not tonight. Not tonight. Not at dinner. Not in front of his parents. Not when it mattered. Later, in the car, Danielle asked the question directly. Why do you never defend me? Grant kept his eyes on the road. Because every time they say something, you act like it's war. They insult my mother. They make comments. They humiliate me. Grant's jaw tightened. My family is blunt. That's not the same thing. Danielle turned toward the window and said nothing after that. But something inside her shifted. She stopped expecting rescue. By year 4, Grant's business was expanding fast. Too fast, in Danielle's opinion. New developments, new acquisitions, high-risk land plays near future transit corridors. He moved through the city like a man certain the next deal would always close. At night, he took calls in other rooms. When Danielle entered, conversations ended. When she asked questions, he said she was overthinking. Then came the paperwork he pushed hardest. A revised estate packet, beneficiary changes, access forms tied to future family planning. He brought them home one evening with takeout and a smile, trying to make the moment feel casual. Let's just get these done, he said. My legal team wants everything aligned before the baby eventually happens. Danielle flipped through the pages. Dense language, trust references, authorizations broader than they needed to be. She looked up. Why does your company lawyer need this much access to my side of the family records? Grant's expression changed instantly. Warmer on the surface, colder underneath. It's not access, it's administrative continuity. That sounds like access. He gave a short laugh. You're reading this like a government analyst, not like a wife. Danielle closed the folder. And you're handing it to me like a husband who thinks I won't read it at all. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Grant reached for the papers and smiled, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. Fine, he said. We can revisit it later. Danielle didn't know it yet, but that moment mattered because behind Grant's calm voice was something new, urgency. And behind the Whitmore family's growing confidence was a belief that time was on their side, that Danielle would stay manageable, that her marriage, her pregnancy, her need for peace would eventually wear down her instinct to question. They were wrong. Danielle didn't understand the full shape of the trap yet, but she had started to feel its walls. Danielle went back to her mother's apartment the morning after the funeral because she could not bear the silence inside the Whitmore house. Grant had slept beside her like nothing had happened. No anger, no apology, no mention of his mother humiliating her in front of Angela's coffin. By sunrise, Danielle was done pretending that kind of silence was normal. So she drove alone to the south side, unlocked the narrow apartment above the tailoring shop, and stepped into the space her mother had protected for decades. The place still smelled faintly of starch, fabric, and old coffee. Half-finished hems rested beneath tissue paper. A measuring tape hung over the back of a chair. Everything looked paused, as if Angela Brooks might walk in at any moment and tell Danielle not to touch a thing until she sorted it herself. That thought nearly broke her. But grief had no room to stay soft for long. Danielle spent the first hour packing dresses into garment bags and stacking client receipts into neat piles. Then she found something strange. At the back of the bedroom closet, behind 2 winter coats and a dented sewing machine case, sat a locked metal box. Danielle frowned. She had never seen it before. The key was taped underneath the shelf. That stopped her cold. Angela had hidden the box carefully, but not permanently. Hidden enough to protect it, easy enough for the right person to find. Danielle unlocked it. Inside were 3 things. A thick envelope with her name written across the front in her mother's handwriting. A business card for Victor Hale, Hale and Mercer, private counsel, and a folded note attached to the card with 1 sentence underlined twice. Do not show this to Grant. Danielle's stomach tightened. She tore open the envelope. The letter inside was short, written in the clean, steady script she had seen on birthday cards and grocery lists her entire life. Danielle, if you are reading this, it means one of 2 things happen. Either I am gone, or something in your marriage has started to feel wrong in a way you can no longer explain away. Danielle sat down hard on the edge of the bed. Her eyes moved faster. You are not imagining it. You are not being overly sensitive. And before you trust your husband, his family, or anyone connected to their lawyers, call Victor Hale. Her breathing changed. No greeting, no sentimental goodbye, no comforting language. Just warning. Danielle turned the page. There are things about our family's financial history that I chose not to explain until I believed you were safe. If I waited too long, that is my failure, not yours. But listen carefully now. Do not sign anything else. Not for your husband, not for his parents, not for any estate planner, corporate attorney, or family office representative they send to you. Call Victor first. Danielle lowered the letter and stared at the wall. Suddenly, the last few years rearranged themselves in her mind. Grant's pressure over documents, the joint accounts, the estate packets, the trust language hidden inside routine paperwork, the way Evelyn watched her whenever legal topics came up, the way Grant always pushed hardest when he sounded calmest. A floorboard creaked behind her. Danielle spun around. Grant stood in the doorway. He must have used the spare key she had forgotten he still had. For 1 second, neither of them spoke. Then Grant's eyes dropped to the open metal box in her lap. "What's that?" he asked. Danielle folded the letter once and kept her face still. Old papers. Grant stepped farther into the room. "From your mother?" "Yes." "Anything important?" The question came too fast. Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "Do you need help?" Anything important? Danielle felt something sharp move through her chest. Grant had asked that like a man checking whether a vault had been opened. She stood slowly. "Why are you here? You left without saying anything." "My mother died yesterday." "I know that." "Do you?" Grant exhaled and leaned against the frame, already irritated. "Danielle, I'm not doing this in your mother's apartment. You didn't do anything at the funeral either." His jaw tightened. "My mother made a comment. She humiliated me beside my mother's coffin." "You're escalating it." Danielle almost laughed. That was always his move. Minimize, reframe, make her sound unstable for reacting to something obvious. Grant nodded toward the box. "Let me see what's in there." Danielle's hand closed over the letter. "No." His expression changed immediately. Not grief, not concern, control. "Danielle," he said quietly, "if this is legal or financial, I need to know." She looked at him for a long moment. Need to know? Grant realized too that sounded, but he didn't correct it fast enough. That was all Danielle needed. She picked up Victor Hale's card and slid the letter back into the envelope. Grant stepped forward. "Who is Victor Hale?" "No idea," Danielle lied. He held out his hand. "Give me the card." "No." "Danielle." "No." The room went silent. Grant had spent years managing her questions, softening her resistance, waiting for the version of Danielle who would rather keep peace than force conflict. But the woman standing in front of him now had buried her mother less than 24 hours earlier. Peace was gone. He took another step. You're upset. Fine. But whatever this is, we handle it together. Danielle's eyes locked on his. No, she said. I think whatever this is, you've been handling it without me for years. Grant froze. It was subtle, but she saw it. A flash of alarm. Small, fast, real, and he covered it. You don't know what you're saying. Danielle moved past him, envelope in one hand, card in the other. By the time she reached the door, Grant had turned to follow. Danielle, don't be reckless. She faced him one last time. The grief was still there. The exhaustion. The pregnancy weight pressing against her back and ribs. But underneath all of it, something else had finally surfaced. Clarity. If my mother went out of her way to warn me about you, she said, then reckless is exactly what I've been avoiding for too long. Grant said nothing. Danielle walked out. 10 minutes later, seated alone in her car with the doors locked, she stared at Victor Hale's number for a full 30 seconds before pressing call. The line rang once, twice, then a calm male voice answered. Victor Hale. Danielle swallowed hard. My name is Danielle Brooks. My mother told me to call you before I trusted my husband. There was a brief pause on the other end. Not confusion, recognition. Then Victor spoke in an even, measured tone. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, do not sign anything. Do not forward any documents, and do not meet your husband alone about family finances again. Danielle gripped the phone tighter. Why? Because your husband's family has been building their future around something that does not belong to them. And for the first time since the funeral began, Danielle understood that her mother had not left her confusion. She had left her a warning. And somewhere behind that warning, an entire hidden war was waiting to be uncovered. Victor Hale's office sat on the upper floor of a quiet brick building near the Chicago River, far from the glass towers where Whitmore lawyers usually worked. Danielle arrived 20 minutes early. Her hands were steady, but her mind was moving fast. Every moment since the phone call had sharpened something inside her. Grant's reaction at the apartment, the urgency in his voice, the way he asked about the box before asking about her. Victor Hale opened the door himself, mid-50s, calm posture, eyes that scanned a room like a man who had spent decades protecting secrets. You came alone? He asked. Yes. Did your husband follow you? No. Victor nodded once and stepped aside. Good. Then we can talk. The office was simple. No flashy decor. No corporate branding. Just shelves of legal binders and a large wooden table in the center of the room. Victor placed a thick folder in front of Danielle before she even sat down. You found Angela's letter? Yes. And you didn't show it to Grant? No. Victor allowed himself the smallest smile. Then your mother made the right decision. Danielle's patience snapped. What decision? She said sharply. Because right now it feels like everyone in my life knew something except me. Victor didn't flinch. That's correct. The words landed hard. Danielle leaned forward. Then start explaining. Victor opened the folder. Inside were property maps, trust documents, and investment reports stretching back more than 20 years. Your mother, Angela Brooks, was part of a small investment group in the late 90s, he began. They bought land most developers ignored, industrial corridors, rail-adjacent parcels, transportation rights-of-way. Danielle frowned. My mother ran a tailoring shop. Yes. That doesn't sound like someone buying rail infrastructure. Victor slid a map across the table. That's because your mother never advertised it. Danielle studied the map. Red lines traced rail expansion corridors running through multiple Chicago districts. Every highlighted parcel belonged to something labeled Brooks Strategic Trust. Victor continued. Most investors sold their shares early. The land didn't look valuable yet. But Angela held her position. She reinvested returns and transferred ownership through a trust structure designed to stay invisible. Danielle's voice lowered. How invisible? Victor met her eyes. Until last week, even you didn't know it existed. Danielle felt her pulse spike. So why does Grant care? Victor flipped another page. A financial summary appeared. Danielle scanned the number once. Then again. 24 billion? she whispered, conservatively. Danielle pushed the paper back as if it might burn her. That's impossible. It's accurate. But if this trust exists, why would Grant's family need anything from me? Victor folded his hands. Because the Whitmore Development Group has been expanding aggressively for years. Large projects, high leverage. Many of those projects depend on redevelopment corridors tied to land your mother's trust quietly controls. Danielle's stomach dropped. They used my family's assets? Indirectly. How? Victor opened another folder. Loan agreements, development projections, land options. And here, Victor said, tapping a page, is where the situation becomes dangerous. Danielle read the line slowly. Conditional access dependent on beneficiary alignment. She looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means several banks approve Whitmore financing under the assumption that the Brooks Trust would eventually cooperate with Whitmore Development Strategy. Danielle felt something cold slide through her chest. They assumed I would sign control. Yes. Did I? No. Then why would they think that? Victor paused. Because this was the moment Danielle needed to hear clearly. Because your husband has spent the last 7 years positioning himself to obtain it. The room went silent. Danielle shook her head slowly. No. Victor slid one final document across the table. Grant Whitmore's signature, dated 3 months before their wedding. A legal inquiry requesting a financial background investigation into Angela Brooks and any associated trusts. Danielle stared at the signature, her husband's handwriting, her husband's curiosity, her husband's timing. Victor spoke quietly. Grant Whitmore knew about the Brooks Trust before he proposed to you. Danielle's throat tightened. That's not possible. It is. He never mentioned it. Of course he didn't. Danielle looked up. Victor's voice stayed calm, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. Mrs. Whitmore, your husband didn't marry you despite your family's financial position. He let the sentence settle before finishing. He married you because of it. For a long moment, Danielle couldn't move. Every memory rearranged itself. The rushed paperwork, the trust language hidden in estate packets, Grant pushing harder every year. The way Evelyn watched her during legal conversations, the way Grant panicked when he saw the metal box. Danielle finally spoke. So what happens now? Victor closed the folders slowly. That depends on what you decide to do next. Danielle stared at the documents covering the table. Her mother had seen it coming. Grant had built his future around it. And somewhere in the middle of their marriage, Danielle had been treated like the only person who didn't deserve to know the truth. Her voice was quiet now. Tell me something honestly. Victor waited. If I do nothing, Victor answered immediately. The Whitmore empire survives. Danielle swallowed. And if I stop them? Victor leaned back in his chair. Then he gave the first honest answer she had heard all week. Then the Whitmore empire collapses. The first crack appeared quietly. No headlines, no scandal. Just a single document filed by Victor Hale 3 days after Danielle left his office. It looked harmless, a routine trust review. But inside the filing was one small change that altered everything the Whitmore family believed they controlled. Danielle Brooks revoked all temporary development permissions tied to the Brooks Strategic Trust. On paper, it was procedural. In reality, it removed the financial foundation under several Whitmore projects. Danielle signed the authorization in Victor's office. Her hand stayed steady. Victor watched carefully. Once this goes through, banks will start asking questions. Danielle didn't hesitate. Let them. Victor nodded once and submitted the filing. The response came faster than either of them expected. 4 days later, a senior banker called Grant Whitmore during a development meeting. Grant stepped out of the conference room to take it. This better be quick, he said, already irritated. The banker's tone was tight. Grant, we have a problem. What kind of problem? Your collateral alignment for the Lakeview expansion just changed. Grant frowned. No, it didn't. Yes. It did. Grant turned away from the glass wall where his investors were waiting. What are you talking about? The Brooks Strategic Trust just withdrew provisional development access. Grant froze. For a moment, he thought he had misheard. That's not possible. It happened this morning. Grant's voice hardened. Who authorized that? Danielle Brooks. The hallway suddenly felt smaller. Grant ended the call without another word. Inside the conference room, 12 investors were studying architectural renderings of Whitmore's next luxury tower. Grant walked back in, forcing his usual confident smile. "Minor paperwork issue," he said. "Nothing that slows the timeline." But even as he spoke, another message appeared on his phone. Then another. 3 lenders requesting clarification. 2 project partners asking for confirmation. 1 lawyer from his father's office asking a single question. Did Danielle sign something? Grant felt a pulse of heat behind his eyes. That night, he drove home earlier than usual. Danielle was in the kitchen reviewing documents from work, one hand resting over her stomach as the baby shifted inside her. Grant placed his keys on the counter, harder than necessary. "We need to talk." Danielle didn't look up immediately. "About what?" "You revoked development permissions tied to your mother's trust." Danielle closed the folder slowly. "Yes." Grant stared at her. "You had no reason to do that." "I had several." "Name one." "You built your company assuming you could control something that isn't yours." Grant laughed once, sharp and disbelieving. "Is this about that lawyer?" "This is about the truth." Grant stepped closer. "Danielle, you don't understand how these structures work. I understand enough to know you've been using my family's assets as silent collateral. That's not how it works." "That's exactly how it works." Grant's voice rose. "Those projects support thousands of jobs. They also support your company. You're jeopardizing major developments. You built them on an assumption." Grant leaned across the counter. "That assumption was our marriage." The words hung in the air. Danielle felt them hit harder than she expected. Grant saw it too. For a moment, he softened his tone. "We're building a life together," he said quietly. "You don't sabotage that life because of paranoia." Danielle met his eyes. "Is that what you call it?" Grant didn't answer. Because for the first time since their wedding, Danielle was no longer reacting emotionally. She was acting strategically, and that terrified him. "Reverse the authorization," Grant said finally. "No." "Danielle." "No." Grant's jaw tightened. "You're pregnant. You're grieving. You're letting that lawyer manipulate you." Danielle stood up. The height difference between them had always made Grant feel like the dominant one in the room. Tonight, it didn't. "You investigated my mother's finances before you proposed to me," she said calmly. Grant's expression shifted, just slightly. But Danielle saw it, and that was all the confirmation she needed. "You knew," she continued. Grant tried to recover. "That's normal background diligence. You built your future around my inheritance. That's not what this is." Danielle leaned closer. "Then explain why 3 banks called you today." Grant said nothing. The silence answered for him. Danielle turned back to her papers. "The trust review stays," she said. Grant stood there for several seconds, calculating. Because the moment Danielle signed that document, something irreversible had started. Banks were reviewing files. Investors were asking questions. And for the first time in years, the Whitmore empire had lost control of a piece of the board. The crack was small. But Grant Whitmore knew something Danielle was only beginning to understand. Empires built on leverage rarely collapse all at once. They start with one missing piece, and then the pressure spreads. The moment Danielle revoked access to the Brooks Trust, she stopped being Grant Whitmore's quiet wife. She became his biggest risk. Victor Hale understood that immediately. 2 days after the confrontation at the house, Danielle sat across from Victor again. This time, the table wasn't covered with trust documents. It was covered with Whitmore financial records. A third person had joined them. "Daniel Mercer," Victor said, "forensic accountant." Mercer nodded politely, but didn't waste time with introductions. He slid a laptop across the table. "You asked what your husband has been building," he said. "Let's start there." Danielle leaned forward. The screen filled with a network map of companies. Whitmore Development Group sat in the center. Around it spread dozens of smaller entities. Property holding companies, construction partnerships, shell LLCs, investment vehicles. Danielle frowned. "Why are there so many?" Mercer answered bluntly. "To move risk." He clicked one node. Whitmore Lakeshore Residential. The luxury tower Grant showed you last year. Danielle recognized it immediately. Grant had celebrated the project for weeks. Mercer continued. financed through 3 banks and 2 private equity groups. But look at the collateral support. Another screen appeared. Danielle felt her chest tighten. Brooks' strategic trust. Mercer nodded. Indirectly referenced. Quietly. Victor spoke. Not illegal, but very intentional. Danielle stared at the numbers. Grant had built a skyscraper assuming access to land that wasn't his. Mercer clicked again. Another project appeared. Transit Corridor Residences. Then another South Loop Tech Complex. Each one carried the same hidden support structure. Danielle felt the scale of it growing. How many projects depend on this? Mercer answered without hesitation. 7 major developments, possibly more. Danielle leaned back slowly. 7. 7 massive deals tied to something Grant had never told her about. Victor folded his hands. Grant's company expanded aggressively because the Brooks Trust made lenders comfortable. Danielle looked up. They assumed I would sign control. Yes. And if I don't? Mercer turned the laptop slightly. A financial projection appeared. Red numbers, loan triggers, debt acceleration clauses. Danielle understood instantly. His company collapses. Victor didn't correct her. Mercer spoke instead. Not immediately, but the pressure builds fast. Danielle exhaled slowly. For a moment, she almost felt sorry for Grant. Almost. Then Mercer opened another file. This part matters more. Danielle leaned forward again. The document displayed a draft post-nuptial agreement, prepared 6 months earlier. Her name appeared on every page. Danielle felt a cold wave move through her body. I've never seen this, Mercer nodded. That's because it was never finalized. Victor pointed to a paragraph halfway down the page. Danielle read it once, then again. Transfer of trust advisory authority to spouse in the event of childbearing and shared estate planning. Her fingers tightened. He planned to make me sign this, Victor spoke quietly. After the baby. Danielle's voice dropped. So once I was pregnant, once everything was harder to walk away from, Mercer finished the thought. The Whitmore family would gain operational access to the Brooks Trust. The room went silent. Danielle stared at the document. Every detail suddenly made sense. Grant's sudden interest in estate paperwork, his calm pressure, the way he always waited for the right time. She closed the laptop slowly. I want to see everything. Victor raised an eyebrow. Everything? Every project, every loan, every company connected to Whitmore Development. Mercer leaned back. That's a lot of work. Danielle's voice stayed steady. So is rebuilding a life. Victor studied her carefully. The woman who had walked into his office days earlier had been grieving, confused, and unsure. The woman sitting across from him now was different, focused, strategic, dangerous in a way Grant Whitmore had never prepared for. Victor finally nodded. Then we start digging. Mercer opened a second database. More companies appeared. More loans, more contracts. Danielle watched carefully, and with every new file, a deeper pattern emerged. Grant hadn't just planned a marriage. He had built an entire empire assuming she would never discover how it worked. But Danielle Brooks had spent her career studying infrastructure systems. She understood networks. Depends, enough, dependencies of dependentials, weak points. And as the Whitmore financial web unfolded across Mercer's screen, Danielle saw something Grant had missed. The empire didn't just rely on her trust. It relied on her staying quiet. That mistake was about to become very expensive. Danielle chose the night carefully. Grant thought the dinner was his idea. He had suggested it that morning, standing in the kitchen with a forced calm that Danielle now recognized as strategy. We should clear the air, he said. My parents are worried this situation is getting out of control. Danielle had simply nodded. Fine, she replied. Let's talk. But the moment the invitation left Grant's mouth, Danielle already knew what the night would become, because she was done answering questions. Tonight, she was asking them. The Whitmore estate overlooked Lake Michigan, its long glass walls glowing against the dark water outside. Danielle had sat at that dining table dozens of times over the years. Tonight it felt like a courtroom. Evelyn Whitmore was already seated when Danielle arrived. Her posture was perfect, hands folded neatly beside a glass of wine. Theodore Whitmore sat at the head of the table, silent, studying Danielle the way investors studied a risky deal. Grant stood behind Danielle's chair. "Thank you for coming," Evelyn said smoothly. Danielle sat without responding. Dinner began with polite conversation that sounded rehearsed. Weather, market trends, a charity event Evelyn had attended the night before. Every sentence circled around the real subject without touching it. Finally, Theodore spoke. "Grant tells us you've been working with outside counsel regarding family assets." Danielle set down her fork. "Yes." Evelyn smiled faintly. "That seems unnecessary." "Why?" "Because family matters should stay within the family." Danielle looked directly at her. "That's interesting." Evelyn tilted her head. "How so?" Danielle reached into her bag and placed a single document in the center of the table. The paper slid across the polished wood. Grant saw the heading first. His shoulders stiffened. Evelyn leaned forward and read the first line. The room went very quiet. Financial inquiry request. Angela Brooks Estate Holdings. Dated 7 years ago. 3 months before Danielle's wedding. Signed by Grant Whitmore. Evelyn looked up slowly. Grant didn't move. Danielle spoke calmly. "I want to ask a simple question." No one interrupted. "Why did my husband investigate my mother's finances before proposing to me?" Grant recovered first. "That's routine background diligence." Danielle turned to him. "For a wedding?" "For a marriage into our family." Danielle's eyes stayed steady. "So you knew?" Grant's jaw tightened. "Knew what?" Danielle leaned back slightly. "That my mother controlled assets connected to redevelopment land across Chicago." Evelyn's smile vanished. Theodore said nothing, but Danielle saw the shift in his posture. Grant tried to stay calm. "You're misunderstanding a complex financial structure." Danielle laughed quietly. "No, I'm finally understanding it." Evelyn placed her wine glass down harder than necessary. "This conversation is inappropriate." Danielle ignored her. "You built 7 development projects assuming access to land tied to the Brooks Strategic Trust." Grant's voice hardened. "You don't know what you're talking about." Danielle slid a second document onto the table. Loan summaries. Collateral structures. Victor Hale's annotations running down the margins. Grant stared at the pages. His silence confirmed everything. Evelyn turned to him sharply. "Grant." Grant spoke through clenched teeth. "This information was confidential." Danielle nodded. "Yes, it was." Theodore leaned forward slightly. "Danielle," he said carefully, "these are complicated financial instruments. You shouldn't jump to conclusions." Danielle looked directly at him. "You built your company assuming you could control my inheritance." Theodore didn't answer, because denying it would have required lying about documents already on the table. Evelyn spoke instead. "You married into a family that builds cities. You should be grateful for the opportunities that came with that." Danielle's voice stayed quiet. "My mother built something too." Evelyn scoffed. "A sewing shop." Danielle met her eyes. "No." Then she pushed the final document across the table. The Brooks Strategic Trust Valuation Summary, $24 billion. Theodore read the number first. Evelyn leaned closer. Grant didn't need to read it. He already knew. For the first time since Danielle entered the room, no one spoke. The balance inside the Whitmore estate had shifted. Evelyn broke the silence. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Danielle stood. "I'm correcting a misunderstanding." Grant finally stepped forward. "You're jeopardizing major projects. You built them on an assumption. On our marriage." Danielle looked at him for a long moment. Then she said the sentence Grant had feared since the day she called Victor Hale. "No," she said. "You built them on my silence." The room felt colder. Grant realized something then. For 7 years, he had believed Danielle didn't understand the game. Tonight, she wasn't just playing it. She had changed the rules. The first lawsuit was filed at 9:12 on a Tuesday morning. Grant Whitmore found out about it from his phone. He was halfway through a meeting with investors on the 42nd floor of Whitmore Development's headquarters when the alert appeared. Civil filing. Brooks Strategic Trust versus Whitmore Development Group. Grant stared at the screen. For a second, he thought it had to be a mistake. Then the second alert arrived. And the third. He opened the filing summary. Trust interference. Financial misrepresentation. Unauthorized collateralization. Each claim was precise. Each supported by documentation. Each tied directly to projects his company had promoted publicly for the last 3 years. Grant closed the file slowly. Across the table, 12 investors waited for him to continue presenting the next phase of the Lakeshore project. He forced his voice steady. Let's take a 10-minute break. The room filled with quiet murmurs as everyone stood. Grant walked straight to the hallway and called Danielle. She answered on the third ring. Hello? You filed a lawsuit? Yes. The calm in her voice made his chest tighten. You're accusing my company of financial fraud. I'm accusing your company of building projects using assets you never had permission to use. That's not fraud. It is when you convince banks the permission is coming. Grant pressed his hand against the glass wall, lowering his voice. You're destroying years of work. No, Danielle said quietly. I'm correcting it. Grant's jaw tightened. You're pregnant, he said. You should not be dealing with this level of stress. Danielle didn't react. You didn't seem worried about stress when you planned to take control of my trust. Grant's voice hardened. That post-nuptial draft was a legal contingency. It was a transfer of authority. You're twisting the language. You wrote the language. Grant closed his eyes briefly. You have no idea what happens when this goes public. Danielle paused. Then she answered the one question he hadn't asked out loud. It already has. Grant's phone vibrated again. 3 incoming messages from his legal team. 2 missed calls from his father. 1 email from a bank titled Immediate Review Request. Grant hung up without another word. Across downtown Chicago, Victor Hale sat in a conference room with 3 litigation attorneys reviewing the next filings. Danielle sat beside him. Are you sure you want to escalate this quickly? One attorney asked. Victor answered before Danielle could. They built an entire financing structure, assuming eventual access to the trust. If we move slowly, they'll try to stabilize. Danielle nodded. Then we move fast. Victor slid another document across the table. Second filing targets the South Loop Tech Complex. That loan depends on projected land access through the trust corridor. The attorney reviewed the page. If this holds, the bank has to freeze funding. That's the point, Victor said. Danielle looked at the timeline. File it. By Wednesday morning, Whitmore Development's legal department was in chaos. Grant's conference room filled with attorneys, analysts, and senior executives. Stacks of documents covered the table. How exposed are we? Grant demanded. His chief financial officer spoke carefully. If lenders believe the Brooks Trust will not cooperate, several collateral assumptions become unstable. Grant slammed a hand on the table. That trust has nothing to do with our projects. The CFO met his eyes. Banks think it does. Another attorney leaned forward. And Danielle's filings suggest you encouraged that assumption. Grant turned sharply. I never promised access. You didn't need to, the attorney replied. You implied alignment through marriage. The room fell silent. Grant suddenly understood the trap. Danielle hadn't accused him of stealing. She had accused him of building an empire on expectations he never actually controlled, which meant every lender now had the same terrifying question. What if Danielle never cooperated? By Thursday afternoon, the first real damage appeared. A private equity partner suspended funding for the Lakeshore Tower. 2 contractors paused work at the South Loop complex. And a major lender requested a full review of Whitmore Development's collateral documentation. Grant stared at the notice in disbelief. His empire wasn't collapsing yet, but something worse had begun. Investors were losing certainty, and in finance, uncertainty spreads faster than bankruptcy. That evening, Grant drove to the Whitmore estate. Evelyn was waiting in the sitting room, the television muted but flashing news headlines across the screen. Theodore stood near the window, reading legal summaries on a tablet. Grant didn't sit. She filed 3 lawsuits in 48 hours. Evelyn's voice was cold. You let her. Grant stared at her. You think I can control what she does now? Theodore spoke quietly. What we think doesn't matter anymore. Grant turned to him. What does that mean? Theodore set the tablet down. It means the woman you marry just introduced legal risk into every project we have running. Grant felt a slow burn rise in his chest. She's bluffing. Theodore shook his head. No. He slid the tablet across the table. Grant read the latest bank notice, funding review, collateral verification, temporary freeze. Theodore's voice stayed calm. This is not a bluff. Grant looked up. For the first time since the lawsuits began, The reality became impossible to ignore. Danielle Brooks wasn't threatening the Whitmore empire. She had already started dismantling it. The story leaked on a Monday morning. Grant Whitmore saw it before he even reached his office. His driver slowed the car at a red light while Grant scrolled through his phone. At first, it looked like a minor business article buried inside the local finance section. Then he saw the headline, "Major Chicago Developer Facing Lawsuit Over Hidden Trust Dispute." Grant's stomach tightened. He opened the article. The details were precise. Whitmore Development, 7 major projects, billions in financing tied to land access, connected to a private trust controlled by Danielle Brooks. Grant read the final line twice. Sources close to the case say the trust's beneficiary has withdrawn cooperation, triggering a legal and financial review of Whitmore projects across the city. Grant closed the article slowly. "Turn around," he told the driver. "We're not going to the office yet." Across Chicago, the story spread faster than anyone expected. First, finance blogs, then local news. By afternoon, the business desks of 2 major newspapers had picked it up. Developers began calling each other. Investors started asking questions. And the same rumor repeated in every conversation. Whitmore built too much on borrowed control. Inside Whitmore Development headquarters, the tension was immediate. Grant stepped into the main conference room and found his executive team already gathered around the television. A news anchor spoke over footage of one of Whitmore's luxury towers. The lawsuit centers on a private land trust believed to control redevelopment rights across several rail corridors. The trust is reportedly held by Danielle Brooks, the wife of Whitmore CEO Grant Whitmore. Grant grabbed the remote and turned the screen off. "Who leaked this?" No one answered. His chief legal officer finally spoke. "The filings are public record now. Reporters connected the trust to your marriage." Grant stared at the table. "How much damage?" The CFO didn't soften the answer. 2 investors suspended funding this morning. Temporarily. They didn't say temporarily. Grant exhaled slowly. "Call them." "We already did." "And?" "They want clarification from the Brooks Trust directly." Grant felt something cold move through his chest because he already knew Danielle's answer. That same afternoon, Danielle sat in a quiet meeting room at Victor Hale's office, watching the same headlines appear one after another. Victor placed a tablet in front of her. "You should see this." The screen showed a Business Channel panel discussing the lawsuit. One analyst leaned forward. "If the Brooks Trust really controls redevelopment land along the transit expansion zones, Whitmore Development may have relied heavily on expected cooperation from the beneficiary." Another analyst added bluntly, "And if that cooperation is gone, lenders will reconsider everything." Danielle said nothing. Victor studied her. "You understand what happens next?" "Yes." "Pressure increases." "Yes." "Grant will try to regain control quickly." Danielle's voice stayed calm. "He already tried." Victor nodded. "Then expect escalation." Meanwhile, at the Whitmore estate, Evelyn Whitmore watched the same coverage with growing fury. "This is humiliation," she said sharply. Theodore sat across the room reading investor messages on his tablet. "It's risk exposure," he corrected. Evelyn turned toward him. "She's destroying this family." Theodore didn't look up. "No." Evelyn frowned. "No?" Theodore finally met her eyes. "She's revealing it." By the end of the week, the shift across Chicago was impossible to ignore. Contractors slowed work on Whitmore projects. 2 development partners quietly withdrew from negotiations. And the city planning office announced a formal review of redevelopment permissions tied to rail corridor properties. Grant watched the announcement replay on his office screen. The words sounded simple, but he understood their meaning immediately. City review meant delays. Delays meant investor panic. And investor panic meant the Whitmore empire had lost its greatest advantage: certainty. Grant leaned back in his chair and stared at the skyline outside his window. For years, the city had treated him like a man who shaped its future. Now that same city was starting to ask a new question. How much of that future had actually belonged to Danielle Brooks all along? Grant Whitmore understood something his lawyers didn't. The lawsuits were dangerous. The media attention was worse. But the real threat wasn't the courts or the headlines. The real threat was Danielle no longer needing him. For 7 years, his leverage had been simple: marriage, access, influence. If he could restore even a small piece of that control, the Whitmore empire might still survive. So Grant changed tactics. 3 days after the city announced its redevelopment review, Danielle received a message. "We need to talk privately." She ignored it. Another message arrived an hour later. "This doesn't have to destroy everything." Danielle still didn't answer. That evening, a black sedan pulled into the underground parking garage of Victor Hale's office building. Grant stepped out alone. Victor's assistant called Danielle immediately. "Your husband is here." Danielle looked at Victor. Victor sighed. "He won't leave without trying." Danielle stood slowly. "Then let him try." Grant entered the conference room with the same calm confidence he used in investor meetings. But Danielle noticed something new. The control in his posture was forced. He sat across from her and placed a single document on the table. "A settlement," he said. Victor leaned back in his chair but said nothing. Danielle didn't touch the paper. "What kind of settlement?" Grant slid the document closer. "Divorce terms, property division, custody agreements once the baby arrives." Danielle's eyes stayed on him. "You came here to discuss divorce?" "I came here to solve a problem." Danielle finally opened the document. It was generous. Half of several Whitmore properties, significant financial support, joint custody agreements that looked balanced and carefully structured. Victor scanned the pages quickly. Then he looked at the last section. His eyes narrowed. Danielle noticed immediately. "What?" Victor tapped the final paragraph. Danielle read it slowly. "Temporary advisory cooperation between Brooks Strategic Trust and Whitmore Development Group during ongoing redevelopment projects." She looked up. Grant held her gaze. "It's a temporary bridge," he said calmly. Danielle's voice stayed quiet. "You're asking me to restore trust access, just long enough to stabilize the projects, so your investors calm down, so thousands of workers don't lose jobs." Danielle almost smiled. "You're good at this." Grant leaned forward. "I'm trying to save something that matters." Danielle slid the document back across the table. "You're trying to save your company." Grant didn't deny it. "Yes." Victor finally spoke. "You built 7 major developments assuming control of assets you never legally possessed." Grant's eyes flicked toward him. "And now those developments employ real people." Danielle's tone hardened. "You should have thought about that before you built them." Grant's calm started to crack. "I built them because I believed my wife would support our future. You built them because you thought I'd never discover the truth." Grant leaned back in his chair. For the first time since the meeting began, his voice lost its smooth edge. "Danielle, listen to me carefully. If these lawsuits continue, the fallout will spread everywhere. Investors lose money, contractors lose work, entire developments stop." Danielle's hand rested lightly over her stomach. "And whose fault is that?" Grant didn't answer, because they both knew the answer. Grant changed tactics again. His voice softened. "We're having a child." Danielle looked at him. "Our child deserves stability." Victor watched her carefully. Grant pressed forward. "I'm not asking you to give up the trust. Just cooperate long enough to unwind the projects safely." Danielle studied him. For a moment, the room felt quiet enough to hear the city traffic outside. Then she asked one question. "When were you planning to tell me about the trust?" Grant hesitated. That hesitation lasted half a second, but it was enough. Danielle nodded slowly. "That's what I thought." Grant leaned forward again. "Don't do this out of anger." "I'm not." "Then what are you doing?" Danielle met his eyes with complete clarity. "I'm ending the assumption that my life belongs to your plans." Grant sat still. For the first time in years, he realized a negotiation was already over. Danielle stood. "The divorce filing will be delivered this week." Grant's voice dropped. "If you do that, you destroy everything." Danielle walked toward the door. "No," she said. "You built everything on the idea that I would never walk away." She paused once before leaving the room. "And that was your biggest mistake." Grant remained seated long after the door closed, because he finally understood something terrifying. The one person who could save the Whitmore empire had just made it clear she had no intention of doing so. The collapse didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in waves. The first wave hit the banks. 2 days after Danielle rejected Grant's settlement proposal, Whitmore Development received a formal notice from its largest lender. The bank was initiating a full collateral review tied to the Lakeshore Tower and 3 connected developments. Grant read the notice in his office, standing perfectly still. Collateral review meant one thing. The lenders were no longer confident the Brooks Trust would ever support the projects. Without that assumption, the numbers changed overnight. Grant called the bank immediately. "You're overreacting," he said sharply. "These lawsuits are a temporary dispute." The banker didn't argue. "We hope that's true," he said. "Then why trigger a review?" "Because your filings referenced land access tied to the Brooks Strategic Trust. That trust isn't part of our financing." It appears several investors believed it was. Grant felt heat rise behind his eyes. Those investors misunderstood. The banker's voice stayed calm. "Then you should clarify it quickly." The line went quiet. Grant knew exactly what that meant. Clarification meant proof. Proof meant documents. And every document led back to the same problem. Danielle controlled the one thing his lenders had quietly relied on. The second wave hit the investors. 3 days later, a private equity partner withdrew from the South Loop Tech complex. The email was short. "Due to uncertainty surrounding collateral alignment, we are suspending our involvement until further notice." Grant read it twice. Then his CFO walked into the office without knocking. "They're not the only ones." Grant didn't look up. "How many?" "2 partners paused negotiations this morning." Grant stood abruptly. "They're panicking. They're protecting themselves." Grant walked to the window overlooking the Chicago skyline. Every tower outside had once felt like proof of his success. Now they looked like leverage points waiting to break. The third wave hit the board. Whitmore Development's emergency meeting lasted less than an hour. Directors sat around the table reviewing updated projections. Grant stood at the front of the room explaining why the situation would stabilize. "The lawsuits are strategic pressure," he said. "Nothing more." One board member interrupted. "Pressure that froze 2 banks and 3 investors." Grant ignored him. "Once the courts review the filings," another director cut him off. "The courts won't solve your collateral problem." Grant's voice hardened. "The Brooks Trust was never legally attached to these projects." The CFO spoke quietly. "No, but it was always assumed." Grant turned sharply. "You're supposed to be on my side." "I'm on the side of numbers," the CFO replied. The room went silent. Another director cleared his throat. "We need to discuss leadership risk." Grant stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means investors are asking whether this company can survive with the current uncertainty." Grant laughed once, sharp and bitter. "You're talking about replacing me. We're talking about stabilizing the company." Grant looked around the room. Men who had praised him for years now avoided his eyes, because they all understood the same thing. The Whitmore empire had been built on confidence, and confidence had vanished. The fourth wave hit the projects themselves. Construction slowed. Contractors demanded payment guarantees. One site shut down entirely after a lender froze a scheduled funding transfer. Workers gathered outside the unfinished tower, confused and frustrated. News cameras arrived within hours. Grant watched the footage on a television inside his office. A reporter spoke over images of silent cranes. Whitmore Development's expansion plans are facing increasing scrutiny following legal disputes tied to a private land trust controlled by Danielle Brooks. Grant muted the television. His phone rang again. This time it was his father. Grant answered immediately. Theodore Whitmore didn't waste time. "The board is considering removing you." Grant closed his eyes. "You built this company with me, and you tied it to a marriage that just collapsed." Grant's voice dropped. "She's doing this deliberately." "No," Theodore said quietly. "You gave her the leverage." Grant didn't respond, because arguing wouldn't change what was happening. Within weeks, the damage became irreversible. 3 projects defaulted on their financing timelines. 2 banks demanded repayment negotiations. Investors filed their own legal complaints against Whitmore Development, and the board called one final meeting. Grant sat at the long table while the directors voted. The decision came quickly. Grant Whitmore was removed as CEO of Whitmore Development Group. The announcement went public that afternoon. Grant left the building through a private exit to avoid reporters. For years, he had believed power meant control, deals, influence, connections. But now he understood something Danielle had realized much earlier. Power was never about how much you built. It was about what those structures depended on. And every piece of the Whitmore empire had depended on a woman they believed would never challenge them. They were wrong. 3 months after Grant Whitmore lost his position, Danielle Brooks walked into the same city planning building where she had worked for years. But this time, the conversation stopped when she entered the room. People watched her differently now. Some with curiosity, some with respect, some with quiet disbelief. Because the woman they used to see reviewing infrastructure reports had just dismantled one of Chicago's most aggressive development empires. Danielle ignored the attention. She had something else to do. Victor Hale and Daniel Mercer were already waiting in a conference room upstairs. Spread across the table were new maps, different from the ones she had seen before. These were not Whitmore expansion plans. These were Brooks Trust redevelopment proposals. Victor gestured toward the documents. Your trust controls land along 3 major transit corridors, he said, the same areas Whitmore tried to build luxury towers. Danielle studied the map. Blocks she recognized. Neighborhoods she had spent years analyzing from a policy perspective. But now she wasn't just reviewing them. She controlled them. Mercer spoke next. The market expects you to sell those parcels to other developers. Danielle shook her head immediately. No. Victor raised an eyebrow. You have buyers ready to pay enormous premiums. I'm not selling. Mercer leaned forward. Then what's the plan? Danielle tapped one of the transit lines on the map. These neighborhoods were supposed to benefit from the rail expansion. Victor nodded. That was the original proposal. But luxury towers would push everyone out, Danielle said. Mercer studied her. You're talking about rebuilding the development structure entirely. Yes. Victor leaned back slowly. That's not a simple investment strategy. Danielle's voice stayed steady. My mother didn't hold that land for 20 years, so someone else could flip it. Victor considered that. What do you want to build? Danielle pointed to the first corridor. Mixed income housing tied directly to transit access. Mercer frowned slightly. That's less profitable. Short term. Victor's eyes narrowed with interest. You're thinking long-term infrastructure value. Danielle nodded. Small business corridors along the rail stations. Affordable housing above retail. Community ownership structures where possible. Mercer leaned back in his chair. You're redesigning the entire development model. Danielle didn't hesitate. Yes. Victor looked at her carefully. You realize you're about to become the most powerful private landholder connected to Chicago transit expansion. Danielle met his gaze. I'm aware. Victor gave a small, approving nod. Then let's build something better than Whitmore ever planned. Within weeks, the Brooks Strategic Trust announced its first redevelopment initiative. The press conference took place inside a community center on the south side, not inside a corporate tower. Reporters filled the room. Danielle stepped to the podium, one hand resting lightly against the curve of her pregnancy. The questions came immediately. Are you replacing Whitmore Development? No. Will you partner with major luxury developers? No. Then who builds these projects? Danielle answered calmly. Local contractors, transit planners, community investors. One reporter leaned forward. You're turning down billions in private development offers. Danielle nodded. Yes. Why? Danielle paused briefly before answering. Because those offers were built on the same assumption that caused this entire situation. And what assumption is that? That the people who built these neighborhoods don't deserve to stay in them. The room went quiet. Construction began slowly at first, but within months, the first Brooks Trust redevelopment site broke ground. Transit-connected housing, retail space reserved for small, local businesses, investment partnerships designed to keep property ownership inside the community. Developers across the city began paying attention, not because the projects were the most expensive, but because they were the most stable. The Brooks Trust didn't depend on fragile investor assumptions. It depended on land that had been quietly secured for decades, and leadership that understood exactly how leverage worked. One afternoon, Victor Hale visited Danielle at the first construction site. Workers moved steel beams into place, while engineers studied transit maps nearby. Victor watched the activity for a moment. You realize something, he said. Danielle looked over. What? Whitmore tried to control the future of this city by concentrating power. Danielle folded her arms. And? Victor smiled slightly. You're doing it by distributing it. Danielle looked across the construction site. Families walked past the fence perimeter on their way to the train station. Small businesses were already signing leases for the retail spaces. For the first time since the lawsuits began, Danielle felt something unfamiliar. Not revenge, not anger, just clarity. Because the Whitmore empire had collapsed, trying to control what was never theirs. And now the same land that had nearly destroyed her marriage was becoming the foundation for something entirely different. 1 year later, the room was full again. But this time, it wasn't a funeral. It was a city redevelopment summit held inside Chicago's Civic Auditorium. Investors, planners, transit officials, and journalists filled the seats, waiting for the final presentation of the afternoon. When Danielle Brooks walked onto the stage, the room quieted immediately. A year earlier, most of these people had never heard her name. Now they knew exactly who she was, the woman who had stopped the Whitmore empire, and the woman who had rebuilt the future they thought Whitmore controlled. Behind Danielle, the screen displayed maps of the first 3 completed Brooks Trust developments: transit-linked housing, retail corridors owned by local businesses, neighborhood investments that had already created thousands of jobs. No luxury towers, no speculative land flips, just projects that worked. Danielle spoke clearly. Chicago's growth has always depended on land, transportation, and the people who hold those systems together. For years, those decisions were made in private rooms by people who believed the city belonged to them. Several people in the room shifted. Everyone knew who she meant. Danielle continued, but cities don't belong to the people who control the most contracts. They belong to the people who live in them. Applause spread slowly across the room. In the back row, one man did not clap. Grant Whitmore sat quietly, half hidden in the shadows of the auditorium. His tailored suits were gone. The confidence that once filled every room with him had faded into something smaller. No reporters followed him anymore. No investors returned his calls. He watched the screen as Danielle's projects filled it. Land he once believed would belong to him. The moderator returned to the stage. "Miss Brooks, one final question," she said. "A year ago, many people believed the Whitmore Company would shape Chicago's future. Now that future looks very different. What changed?" Danielle paused. Then she answered simply. The truth came out. The room grew quiet again. "Power built on control can collapse quickly," she continued, "but power built on responsibility lasts longer." The applause this time was louder, decisive. Grant stood slowly before it ended and walked toward the exit. Danielle never looked in his direction, because the man who once believed he controlled her future no longer had any role in it. And as the crowd rose to its feet, the city finally understood something it had missed for years. The quiet woman they once underestimated had never needed revenge. She only needed the truth. And if stories about courage, justice, and unexpected strength resonate with you, stay with this channel. Because sometimes the most powerful victories begin the moment someone decides they're done being underestimated.